building business afternoon 3, because all sorts of things seem to be going on in my paper tonight. But it's good to be back again to talk about other aspects of local history and to look at ways in which we can maybe understand our local history a bit better. I personally find tonight's subject particularly interesting. Over the last few years I've come across a lot of local history, whether it's through talking to people who are interested in their local history or reading articles in local history journals. And the one thing that has really struck me forcibly is the way in which local history in Ireland does tend very much to have a rural dimension to it, very much focused on the countryside, on issues of land, townlands, farming practices, rural folklore, etc. Can you hear me now? You can hear me now, okay. But tonight I want to think instead about the town, and if you were studying a local town, what might you be looking for in terms of looking at it? What might you want to focus on in terms of development, etc. And most importantly, what sources might you use when it comes to studying a local town? I have been thinking very much of looking at a variety of small towns across Ulster to give you a taste of different ways of looking at urban history, but I have to say at the minute Belfast in particular is to the forefront of my mind when I think of urban history. I think we're all very conscious of the advertising campaign that's on our TVs and radios at the minute, which declares this is our time and our place. And I feel very much that this is particularly Belfast's time to shine. Next year, in 2013, Belfast is going to be celebrating the 400th anniversary of the granting of its royal charter as a borough, which in itself is a significant event and something really worth commemorating. The charter was granted to Sir Arthur Chichester, and the family would eventually become the Earls of Donegal, by King James I. And in this way, 400 years ago, next year, the birth of the city, in many ways, as we know it today, occurred. And if that was the birth 400 years ago, I feel that 100 years ago, around 1911, 1912, in many ways, Belfast came of age. It was a very exciting time in its history, and as mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, this year Belfast celebrates the launch of the Titanic, and although the ship has become very much associated with desperate tragedy and loss of life, it also does represent the incredible success story that was Belfast just 100 years ago. And something of that excitement, that sense of developing and booming does seem to be in the air again, perhaps. And with this, we think back to that era of economic growth and success. By the end of the 19th century, Belfast was Ireland's largest and most dynamic urban space, having briefly overtaken Dublin as Ireland's largest city in terms of size and importance. And it's also a leading player in the British urban and industrial scene, a very important city. During the second half of the 19th century, Belfast witnessed phenomenal growth in terms of its population, the development of its industries and its economic output. As one Belfast man stressed in the 1890s, Belfast had done incredibly well during the second half of the 19th century, and I quote from him, he said, "Her population had quadrupled in 50 years, her wages rates were higher than anywhere in Ireland. As to customs revenues, she ranked as the third port in the United Kingdom. She had the largest weaving factories, the largest shipping output, the largest tobacco factory, and the largest ropework in the world." So really, Belfast 100 years ago was an incredible success story. It was a boom town like no other, and the success of the city was very much built on the twin foundations of linen and shipbuilding. So I think it's fitting, therefore, that although I will be mentioning other towns, the main focus of my talk tonight will be particularly on Belfast. But before we look at Belfast, and before we take a brief walk through the history of the town, I want to look first of all at urban history itself. We've asked what is urban history? How did urban history come about? Now, in our initial lecture way back at the start of the series, Janice Holmes here talked to us about the way in which local history has changed over centuries and decades and even years, and that change seems to have escalated and increased as we come closer to the present day. And it has evolved into something much more than just simple antiquarianism. And history, in particular local history, is changing all the time. Particularly in the later 20th century, historians in Britain in particular, to a less extent in Ireland, although Ireland's now catching up, they have been increasingly looking at history away from the traditional political history, the traditional top-down approach that historians have always liked to take, which was looking at important developments, leaders, political leaders, etc. And instead, history is increasingly now looking at the lives of ordinary people. What made people tick at any particular point in time? What were ordinary people's lives like? How was the experience of everyday life in various parts of the country impacted by big important developments and events? And in line with these broad developments in history, the concept of urban history in particular was developed in the 1960s, when a group of historians at the University of Leicester got together and decided they needed to work on developing a centre for the study specifically of urban history. And now it's a major subdiscipline in the UK, and it's increasingly now beginning to take off in Irish universities and in Irish history organisations as well. We have some major scholarly journals devoted to it, so if you want to read about urban history, you can get the journal called Urban History and read up on it. But what do these scholars actually study? I mean, do they just look at a particular town and give the history of that town from the beginning to now? No, they take a slightly different approach, a more thematic approach maybe. Urban history is about much more than just the history of the town from zero to now. It's about developing particular lines of investigation, looking at themes and towns. Now, some urban historians have begun to think about big questions that relate specifically to one example of a town perhaps, but also to towns in general. Asking questions such as how do and how did towns and or cities actually work as a unit? So looking at a town as a unit, almost as an evolving organism that has different parts to it that interact with each other. And thinking about the purpose of a town, for example, how did it emerge, how did it evolve over time? What are the different interest groups within a town? How do they interact with each other? Another point that interests urban historians is not just looking at a town as a unit, but looking at ways in which towns and cities interact with each other as well, the way one might impact on another. We can think, for example, of the development of Belfast, which was originally a market town, became an industrial town, but the growth of Belfast had an impact on the growth of Bangor, for example, as Bangor became a flourishing seaside town. So looking at relationships like that is also very interesting, and using one particular case study as a way of addressing bigger issues. Now, one particular way of looking at towns and cities is to think about that question: why do they exist at all? How did they come about? What was their original purpose? And I think this is a good place to start when we're thinking about whatever local town we're interested in, because it helps us understand more about why the town's there, why it has the character it has, and why it's developed the way it has over time. Now, Rosemary Sweet is an urban historian who has developed a typology for towns. She has developed different categories of towns that she thinks most will fit into. The first that she has identified as manufacturing towns. In an English context, we can think of places like Birmingham and Manchester that have very much grown and flourished on a manufacturing base. And Belfast, 19th century Belfast, is a classic example of a manufacturing town, although it didn't start out that way. We can also think of other towns across Ulster which were very much based on industry, on factories and mills. We think of places like Lurgan or Guildford that had a strong industrial base at a local level. The other type of town that Rosemary Street has identified as the market town, and we're very familiar with those in Northern Ireland. We think of this like Ballyclare, Ballynahinch, lots of market towns dotted across the countryside. And we think about their origins as market towns. We look at the way, the layout of them, the type of people who use them, the way in which the countryside interacted with them. It all helps to make sense of how that particular town came into being. Another type of town that Sweet identified was the port. Liverpool and Glasgow, for example, being ports, but also having a heavy manufacturing base. Belfast also, although it started as a market town, evolved into a manufacturing town. The port was also a crucial part of Belfast's development through that period. Newry was a very, very important port, and I think for us to understand the history of Newry, for example, seeing it as a major port of international importance is actually very important. Warren Point and Larne are also examples that we could look at. And finally, Sweet identified what she called the leisure town, the place where people went, particularly in the earlier period, wealthy people, but as the 19th century progressed, as transport became more readily available, also working class people on their day off taking a trip to the seaside. So the leisure town evolving as a particular place where people went to rest, to relax, to meet people, to see people and to be seen. We can think of examples here, Bangor, obviously, Newcastle, Portrush and Portstewart. And 100 years ago people would have gone to those places to promenade in their finery, to be seen. Nowadays we've got young lads in their cars driving around and around the one-way system. Some things change only slightly. But that in itself, the development of a leisure town, a place where people went for specific purposes, helps us maybe understand those. And I might also add to Sweet's list two types of towns. One might be the landlord's town, the town that was planned and developed by a landed family. We think, for example, of Hillsborough or Brookborough as classic examples of those that were actually, they originated because the landlord wanted to develop a town. And the other thing we have here, of course, that doesn't quite fit into Sweet's typography is the plantation town. When thinking about the function of the town, we also need to be aware of the fact that this function changes over time. And I've mentioned obviously Belfast, which has evolved from being very much based on trade and commerce to being based on manufacturing. But if we start with this idea, as I say, it does help us to develop the way in which we might take our research forward, thinking about where the town came from and what sources in particular we might look at. And at the end of the talk today, I'll briefly talk about the types of sources you might use. But by thinking about the type of town it is, in that way that'll direct us towards sources. So leisure towns, for example, you might be looking at things like playbills, what was on in the theatre, or you might look at newspapers to see, again, adverts with things, events that were happening, or reports of things that had happened. On the other hand, if you're looking at a manufacturing town or a commercial town or city, things like trade directories are going to be hugely important to help you build up a picture of who were the major players in that town at the time. As I mentioned at the outset, there is a strong tendency towards rural themes in Irish history and local history in particular, but it's not just local history, it's really history in Ireland in particular per se has had a very strong rural tendency towards it for many, many years. And in some ways it's not surprising, as I say, when we look at the way history in Ireland in particular has developed. For many decades, Irish history has been about, in some ways, the struggle for national independence. So we look at key characters, key people who might have been involved in that, and also the resistance to that struggle for national independence. So politics playing a huge part. And up to now, really, towns haven't really been central to that type of historical narrative. It's very much the countryside, the land, the struggle between landlords and tenants, etc. Those are the big concerns that have really occupied historians.